Let's talk about the determinants of supply, or in other words, what are the factors that affect supply? Well, we divide factors that affect supply in two sort of big categories. The one is what we call price factor, which is a very important one, and the second one, big category, is what we call non-price factors. Just like demand theory, the price factor will be resulting in a what we call a movement along the supply curve. So something like this, any change in price will result in a movement along the supply curve, while the non-price factors will result in what we call a shift of the supply curve. So when we look at the movement along the supply curve, so we know this, that if there is a change in price, this will result in a change in quantity supplied. We've been discussing this, that if you draw a supply curve, whenever there's a change in price, you will see a change in quantity supplied, which means we are moving from one point on the supply curve to another point on the supply curve. So this is what we call a change in quantity supplied. But whenever there is a change in the non-price factor, you will see the supply curve to actually end up shifting to the right or to the left. So if I just make this diagram one more time, and let me just label it properly. This is price and quantity. So if I want to show you guys the non-price factor, the non-price factors will result in the supply curve to shift either to the right, which is called a rise in supply, or to the left, which is called a decrease in supply. So look at this, guys, that if the price is P1, and let me zoom this diagram, if the price is P1, if the price is P1, and if you look at the quantity for the same price of P1, a factor which is a non-price factor can make the supply curve shift to the right, but for the same price P1 there could be a non-price factor that can result in supply to fall, like for example this quantity, okay, which means that when the price remains constant and yet the quantity produced is going up, there could be what we call a non-price factor playing a role. So when I go from S0 to S1, I can say there is a rise in supply, while when I go from S0 to, for example, S2, we can say there's a fall in supply. So what are the factors that can result in what we call a shift of supply curve, which is a non-price factor? Um, let's discuss that. We know this, that if ever there's a change in price, there will be a movement along the supply curve. And so now we need to look at what are the factors that can shift the supply curve, or what are the factors that can increase or decrease the supply curve. The first factor which can result in supply curve to shift is the cost of production. We know firms are aiming to maximize profits, and anytime there is a change in cost of production, it can result in the profitability of firms to go down or go up. And if there is a change in profitability, of course, there will be a change in willingness to produce a good. So, what are the factors that can make the cost of production to change? Well, the first one could be your input prices. What are inputs? We discussed that earlier. Inputs are your land, labor, capital, and of course enterprise. These are the uh, inputs that are required for the production. So anytime there is a change in, for example, wage, or if there is a change in rent, or if there is a change in interest, that can result in cost of production to change. So for example, let's assume that the rent goes up. A rise in rent would mean cost of production will go up, and this rise in cost of production would mean firms are willing to supply less at each and every price. Now, this means that if I draw my supply curve for this situation, your supply curve will be shifting backward. So if this is my original supply curve, let's call it S naught, my supply curve will be shifting backward, like for example S1, because the cost of production has gone up. So for a particular price, let's use like P naught, if you were making Q naught before, your willingness to produce has gone down to Q1 as the cost of production has gone up. Important way to look at this is figuring out, like how much is your change in cost. So this diagram actually can also help us explain the change in cost. If I want to show the change in cost per unit, I can do that by looking at the vertical distance AB. So this vertical distance AB tells me what my change in cost is. For example, let's say at sort of price of P1, I was making Q1 quantity before when the supply curve was S naught. And because of the rise in cost of production, let's say my supply curve went to S1, and now I'm making same Q1 at a higher price of P naught. So this price, let's say, was $5, and let's say this one is, let's say, $7. So this means that my change in cost per unit is actually going to be $2. And how did I figure that out? This vertical distance between the two supply curves tells us the change in cost per unit, because for the same quantity, I was accepting a price of $5. Now for the same quantity, I'm accepting a price of $7. So keeping everything else constant, this means my change in cost is $2 per unit. So while the vertical distance tells us the change in cost for each and every quantity, the horizontal distance is telling us the change in quantity for each and every price. Another important factor that can change our costs of production in the long run is technology, and technology changes can be shown through shifts of supply curve. Because let's say if this was your supply curve before, and I said to you that there is an improvement in technology, this improvement in technology results in the cost of production to actually go down. So any improvement in technology results in the cost of production to fall, which will result in supply curve to rise. So another factor that can cause our supply curve to shift to the right, or for the cost to lower at each and every quantity, is our changes in technology. Any improvement in technology can make the supply curve shift to the right, while any decrease in technology or anything that affects our technology in a negative manner can make the cost of production to go up, and therefore the supply curve to shift to the left. So the second factor that can affect our cost of production independently is technology. The third factor we would like to talk about, which can also affect our cost of production, is changes in productivity. When I say changes in productivity means productivity of all factors of production. So for example, if I am producing goods in a farm and the farm productivity go up because of better technology, or because of better machinery, or because of better labor productivity, or because of better pesticides or insecticides, or any technology that I'm using, that changes in productivity can also make my cost to change. So for example, if there is a rise in productivity, better productivity of workers would mean the cost of production will fall, because the worker or the machinery or the inputs are making me a greater output for the same cost. So cost per unit will fall, and that cost of production to fall means supply to rise. So any improvement in technology can result in supply curve to shift to the right. Another important factor that we would like to discuss is changes in the price of related goods. When we look at related goods, we're looking at two kinds of goods. So it could be what we call joint supply or competitive supply. What do we mean by joint supply? Well, joint supply simply means when two goods are jointly supplied, there must be what we call a byproduct For example, when you produce more honey, beeswax automatically comes as a byproduct. So, in other words, higher supply of honey, when the supply of honey goes up, means higher production of or supply of beeswax. Let's So I'm going to draw first the market for honey, and at the same time I'm going to look at market for beeswax. So if this is my supply curve for honey, and let's assume that for some reason people are consuming more honey, so the production of honey is going up, maybe because of higher demand. So higher production of honey means that automatically beeswax, which is a byproduct of it, will be produced, and the supply curve for the beeswax industry, this is your beeswax industry, will see a shift to the right. And this is an independent factor, guys, which is making this supply curve to shift, and not a dependent factor, in the sense that it was not because of cost of production or any reason that the supply has gone to the right, but because you are producing more honey, automatically higher beeswax is produced. Similar to this idea is the idea of competitive supply. So what is competitive supply? When two goods are in competitive supply, this means that they are kind of like in competition to each other in terms of input. So for example, let's say if I'm a farmer who can produce oranges and lemon, which is by the way from the same citrus family, so I can produce oranges and lemon in my land, and let's say I decided, you know what, I'm going to produce more of oranges. That would mean that probably I'm going to get more profits from oranges. So let's say this is my supply curve for oranges, and for some reason I am encouraged to produce more. Maybe I believe that there is a better price and better demand, and so I am producing more of oranges. So the quantity supplied of oranges is going up, but that would mean I have less of land available for for lemon. So while I am producing more of oranges, the supply of lemons from the market will go down. And why is that so? The supply curve will shift backward, because now for each and every price there is less of lemons produced, because there are less of lemons available in the less of land available to grow lemons now. So this is kind of like in a competitive supply, that when the production of one good can lead to less production of the other, because the inputs that are being used are used for one thing and not for the other. Another factor, guys, that can make the supply curve shift to the right is number of firms. A lot of times, number of firms can go up in an industry. So, industries that are profitable will see entry of new firms, and that entry of new firms can make the supply curve shift to the right for all the industry. So entry of new firms can make the supply curve rise, and this entry of new firms mainly happen when an industry is profitable, because profitable industries will encourage new firms to enter, and that would mean supply curve will shift to the right for the industry for that good. So a good example of this is that many A-level schools have opened recently, and that has resulted in the supply of schools in the market for A level education has gone up because of entry of new schools in the market. Exogenous factors also play a role when it comes to increasing or decreasing supply. What are exogenous factors? Exogenous factors are factors that are independent or do not depend on the production process. For example, in production, we know this: if there is, for example, floods or a heat wave or a drought All of those could if affect our farming productivity, and all of this can affect a farming supply. Similarly, a major accident or a terrorist act or a war may affect the supply of, for example, many goods, like for example oil. And so exogenous factors are independent factors which can also affect supply and can shift supply curve to the right or to the left. A good example of this could be, like good weather can result in higher supply of agricultural goods. So you could have a bumper crop, a good crop, because an external factor, like um, for example, good weather is causing the supply to rise. Lastly, guys, government policies also play a role. What are government policies? Well, government policies can be looked into two ways. Number one is the policies of taxes, and we will have a longer discussion later on. And there's also policies of subsidies. What are taxes? Taxes are basically, I'm talking about indirect taxes mainly, because direct taxes are on income. Indirect taxes are taxes on expenditure. And whenever we put an indirect tax, we put an indirect tax on a producer. And what that does is basically that results in the cost per unit to go up. So let's see this in terms of a diagram. So let's assume that the tax that the government put on a good is, let's say, $2 per unit. And the government can put taxes for many reasons. They may want to do this for discouraging production of a particular good. They may do it for raising revenue, or any other reason that they want to sort of put a tax on. But whatever the reason is, let's say the government decides to put a tax. So if my supply curve is, for example, S naught, and currently, let's say, for 10 units, the firm is charging, let's say, $5. When we put a tax of $2 per unit, the cost per unit will go up by $2. So something which was made for $5 per unit will now be made for $7, which would mean the supply curve will shift to the left by $2, and this vertical distance AB is telling us this change in cost per unit, which is of $2, and which is happening because now this is after tax supply curve. So whenever we put a tax on a good, the supply curve will shift backward. On the other hand, whenever we give a subsidy, what is subsidy? Well, subsidy is simply government sort of grant to encourage production of a good, and we give this grant to basically lower the cost of production. So it's a kind of like opposite to taxes. While taxes are making the cost per unit to go up, subsidies by government are trying to sort of encourage production of something, like for example vaccine. You may want to sort of subsidize vaccine, so that subsidy will result in the cost of production to go down. So let's say the subsidy is $2 as well, and let's say previously I was charging $10 per unit and I was making 20 units. Now with the subsidy of $2, supply curve will shift to the right, and this vertical distance AB is telling us that this is the reduction in cost because of subsidy, because now the cost will be $8 for the same 20 units, and this is, by the way, $8 per unit. So your supply curve S1 will be after subsidy. So while taxes can make the supply curve shift backward, subsidies, which are grants by the government for the production of goods like vaccine, could result in supply curve to shift to the right.